evening, everyone. How are you? Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on out and giving me a chance to be able to say a few words to all of you. And RIPAC, Professor, thanks so much for pulling this event together. I guess, the theme of this is about, a vision for America. So I guess I just wanted to kind of take it in a few directions and then we can go into the questions. As mentioned in the introduction, my parents immigrated to this country. Actually, they immigrated here 50 years ago to this year. And so when I think about the vision that my family has had of America, it starts then, 50 years ago. And I've said it before, and I'll say it here, they didn't know anybody else in the entire Western Hemisphere of planet Earth when they came here. And so the first visions that they had of America, is just this idea of the idea that they would travel halfway around the world to come to a place where they didn't know anybody. It just shows how potent and powerful that idea of America was for them. And when I asked them why they do it, they said that we did it because we knew that here in America, we could guarantee that the family that we raised would have a better life and more opportunities than we did. And that word guarantee, they thought it was a place where they could guarantee opportunity, a better life. My parents, they had a tough childhood. My dad was born with polio. He suffered in poverty. He was even homeless for part of his childhood in an area of Korea devastated by the war. My mom was born to a poor farm family, to a single mom. Neither of them thought they'd have a shot at life. And here in America, my dad ended up getting a PhD in genetics. My mom ended up getting a nursing degree. So that sense of opportunity was so real for them. It electrified them. It excited them. And when they thought about where they wanted to raise a family, to make good on that promise and that guarantee, they chose South Jersey. And, Marlton, I went to high school in Cherry Hill. My dad was at a lab trying to cure cancer in Camden, New Jersey. My mom worked at then Kennedy Memorial Hospital in Cherry Hill. Gave them their first jobs. Gave me a public school education that transformed my life. That was, the previous 50 years. And I feel really blessed and humbled that on the 50th anniversary of my parents coming to the United States, that I have a shot at being a United States Senator. We feel really blessed about that. But now the question is, what's the next 50 years? Because I'm standing before you now as a father of a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And I think about it right now, and I have to tell you, all I want for my kids is the same thing that my parents wanted for me. All I want to do is be able to tell my kids, I guarantee you that you will have a better life and more opportunities than me. But when I look at what's happening around the world right now, we got conflicts and crises, wars. Domestically, we got so much challenge, so much vitriol, so much divisiveness in our country right now. I'll be honest with you, I struggle right now because I don't actually know if I can look my 2 kids in the eye right now and say to them that same thing my parents to me. I don't know if I can actually tell my kids, I guarantee you that you will have a better life and more opportunities than me. And that worries me. I'm worried about what kind of America my kids are going to grow up in. And I look at the challenges right now. I mean, this is a moment of immense challenge. I really do believe that the next 4 to 5 years are going to shape the next 4 to 5 decades of this country. That's how pivotal of a moment this is. As someone who's worked in foreign policy, I worked in U.S. worked in diplomacy and national security over my career. I look at this moment. This is the most unpredictable and chaotic international moment I've ever seen during my lifetime. And as someone who worked in national security, the thing I hate most in life is unpredictability. I can't stand it. And there's a lot of that out there right now. It's worrisome. So when I think about the vision for the next 50 years, I'm dedicating a lot of my time in Congress and hopefully will continue to dedicate time, focus on this question of what does American strategic competitiveness mean in this moment? What does American global leadership mean in this moment? We are clearly no longer in the post 9/11 world. We're in an altogether new paradigm shift moment in global politics. And this moment has yet to be defined. What we know is that it has contours of renewed great power competition. Even some of my colleagues go as far as to call it a new Cold War. I disagree with that. But there's no doubt that we live in a more multipolar world. We're moving away from the moments of unipolar American hegemony, moving into a moment of greater challenge. Yes, I think the U.S.-China competition is going to be a key part of that, but there's a lot of other moments in this. So that's why I focus so much of my time in Congress thinking about how to be able to ensure another 50 years of American strength. Actions like the bipartisan infrastructure law, making sure we can rebuild our state, rebuild our country, prepare us for what comes next. Also, making sure that we take actions like the CHIPS and Science Act, the largest investment in advanced manufacturing in modern American history. Trying to both reshore as well as make our supply chain more resilient, try to keep our country more protected from global shocks, trying to make sure we're addressing some of the economic challenges that we're facing, that we're investing in ourselves. While this moment is a scary moment globally, it is also paired with probably the most exciting and fast-moving, rapid technological advances during my lifetime. So we're pairing a moment of unpredictability on the global front with a moment of sheer velocity when it comes to innovation. That can be a double-edged sword. But I'm excited about that. I want us to harness that. I think the United States is well positioned more than any other country to dominate the next 50 years of technology. But we have to invest in it. So I'm always thinking about what's the next thing? What's the 2.0 version of the CHIPS and Science Act? How do we take this into the next realm? Build on it with the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest investment in energy and fighting climate change in our nation's history, frankly, in human history. Those are things that I want to push forward on to be able to see what comes next. In addition to that, though, what we also recognize is that we live in a moment of the greatest amount of inequality in our nation's history, even worse than the robber baron age that we studied in the textbooks. And it's getting worse and worse. I don't think this is a sustainable trajectory when it comes to the sheer level of disparity. And it's something that I've come to really see with my own eyes as I've gone around Jersey over the course of the last 6 years. Seeing just the amount of hunger in my own congressional district. I represent a district of 780,000 people. We estimate about 65 to 70,000 people in my congressional district are considered food insecure, which we know is just a bureaucratic way of saying they're hungry. About 16 to 18,000 of them kids. We take steps like the child tax credit, the most effective piece of legislation we've passed in modern history in terms of addressing child poverty. We cut child poverty in half in less than a year. But then the Republican Congress repealed it in the House of Representatives. So there's a real question about what role does our government play? What role should we be engaged in to try to address this? I don't have all the answers. There are a lot of challenges, and a lot of it revolves around the 3 H's of housing, healthcare, and hunger. But there's so many other elements of this that we have to get a grip on. Otherwise, I worry that we're just going to spiral out of control. The centripetal forces are just too much for us to bear without a gravity to pull us back together. The third thing I want to say is so much about this, whether it's about the global competitiveness or focused on the issues here at home when it comes to the deep inequality. There is a fundamental question that stands in the way of, can we actually come to agreement as a nation on how to address these problems? I had a leader in a South Asian country call me up last year. And he gave me a call, and I picked up the phone, and he said, Andy, you're not really going to default on your debt, are you, as a country? And I said, well, look, I'm going to do everything I can to prevent us from defaulting on our debt as a country, but I can't guarantee it. And he just, on the other end of the phone, he was like, huh. That's what the sound is. He's like, huh. And he's like, I just wanted you to know he said this to me. He's like, I just want you to know when I go and talk to officials in other countries and we talk about your country, we talk about America, the thing that we say is a question. Is America a reliable partner? And he said that question knowing full well what the answer is right now. And it's an answer we don't like. The answer right now is no. We join the Paris Climate Agreement, we leave the Paris Climate Agreement, we join it, we leave it, we join it. Like, no one knows what to think about us. The most fundamental way to talk about it is like, what is the value of the American handshake right now? Does it mean anything? Can people rely on us? What value is it to have the world's most powerful military or the world's most powerful economy if people don't trust us? When we talk about the Taiwan Strait and other challenges that are out there, it's not just China and others. They're not just assessing American military might, how many submarines we have in the Indo-Pacific. They're wondering that if the shit hits the fan, can America make a decision? Will we be in a place where we can act? Or are we going to be paralyzed by our own ineptitude? So I lay those 3 points out for you. The global challenge, a domestic challenge, and then a political challenge. All of those interconnected. None of them inextricably linked from the other. But it dawns on us the challenge of our generation, what it is that we need to try to get done. And we are just on an unsustainable trajectory when it comes to the divisiveness of our politics. And it's shameful, honestly. It's embarrassing. And it's something that holds our country back from such greatness. A sense of self-sabotage when we see it out there in its full form. But what I hope you take away from this conversation today is it doesn't have to be this way. I would not be doing this if I didn't have hope that we can change. That I still believe in the America that inspired my parents 50 years ago to leave everything behind to come here. That I do a job, I tell you I do this for my kids, but I do a job that takes me away from them half the year. I only would do this if I felt like what I'm trying to do is give my kids a better life. That I can try to address these issues. And one day, hopefully, I can look my 2 kids in the eye and tell them, I guarantee you, you will have a better life and more opportunities than me. That's why I'm here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Congressman. So we've got about a half hour before the Congressman, I promise his staff, has a hard stop. So we got a bunch of questions that got submitted here tonight and when people registered. Let me start just because I want to pick up on something you mentioned in your comments that you talked about what comes next. And that leads to this question that was submitted about generative AI. AI is providing a very powerful new creative tool, while at the same time, creating very complex copyright questions, threats to artists, livelihoods. How do you feel Congress should approach harnessing new AI technologies while protecting the artistic and creative community and their economy?
Yeah, I think this is one of the defining questions as I laid out in my remarks in terms of what comes next. I have never seen people in innovation and technology this excited and this scared about what comes next. People that I know working in AI literally coming to me and telling me, you got to slow us down. You got to find ways for us to be able to comprehend what's about to come. Because, we always say technology moves faster than government or our capacity to understand. This is exponential. Arts and entertainment, certainly a big part of it. Healthcare is a big part of it. Politics and so many other aspects of it. First and foremost, what we want, ideally, is we want AI to be a tool that can augment human action, human capabilities, creativity. There's a lot that we can see in the creative space in which that can happen. I mean, just, amazing abilities to be able to generate images and videos, to be able to generate, words on a page and use that to be able to help build off of. You know, I know artists that use a lot of AI right now to generate concepts that they can then build upon and be able to grow upon and be able to do that with greater speed than they've ever been able to do before. But what we're worried about, though, is not augmentation, but replacement. And what would happen in that kind of capacity? You know, you see this right now with a lot of actions from unions, whether it's the longshoremen or whether it's, you know, those in the creative arts, what we saw with the Writers Guild and others over the past few years stepping up and addressing this fundamentally of just, you know, what do we know about our own efforts? Challenges right now to large language models about what information was fed into it and whether or not that is something then that causes, you know, the desire, you know, causes the need for royalties or other types of compensation for those that produce the information that was then used to train the large language models. You know, these are all very important, up for grabs. I can't tell you we have found the perfect way to address it, but we are starting from a standpoint of trying to triage what are the biggest harms that are out there. You know, I work in the national security space, deep concerns about, you know, about the weaponization of AI, about using machine learning and capabilities, merging that with, you know, autonomous drones and other types of robotic technologies. You know, understand what does it mean for lethal force in the age of AI and robotics? You know, are we at a place when we can actually say for certain who is going to be responsible and held accountable for a death on the battlefield if it's done by artificial intelligence or a robot? You know, we're at that point now where that is no longer science fiction and we have to think it through. When we look at what happens, you know, on that, what happens with the jobs, and as you said, in arts and entertainment, you know, other aspects of that, yes, the creative space is going to be fundamentally different one way or another. And I hope that we can find ways to be able to think that through. But what is helpful for me, and I'd love to stay in touch with folks here, is that it's important for me. I come to my job with a lot of humility. I can't think about all the different permutations in which how AI might affect, you know, those in the creative arts. But those in the creative arts, they're thinking about this day in and day out, and it's important for us to be able to have that conversation. You know, so please, you know, I hope to be somebody that can be accessible, someone that can try to think strategically about what comes next. The challenge, though, is I work in what's arguably the most reactionary building in America. You know, it is a building that isn't known for its foresight, isn't known for its long horizon and thinking strategically. So I hope to be able to bring something different, you know, a different approach to our politics in that way. You know, be somebody that can try to think about what is America going to look like 10, 30, 20, 30 years from now. And I hope to be somebody that can really try to usher in a responsible way, this new era of technology.
Thank you. Congressman, every poll out there says the economy, on some variation about questions about the economy, dominate the focus of voters heading into this election. Economy is always the top issue. So we had several questions on it. I want to try and get to a couple of them. America seems to be facing a significant disconnect when it comes to the economy. On one hand, at least on paper, things are getting better. New jobs are being created, inflation is falling. On the other hand, the public doesn't seem to believe it. Polls show that voters are frustrated, even angry with the state of the economy. So from your perspective, what is the state of the national economy, and why does it seem to be we have this disconnect between the numbers and public opinion?
Yeah, look, when we think about our economy, and we're thinking about the metrics in which to measure the success and health of the economy, we do need to reimagine that. You know, I don't think that the way in which we describe it, the way in which we're capitalizing on this, is representative of the broader health writ large in this country. You know, it is very clear from my experiences out there that people are really struggling right now. You know, when you think about the stock market, you're thinking about the growth in these, you know, in these industries. You know, but you also recognize that over half of Americans are not invested in the stock market, not invested in different ways. You know, you see the huge discrepancies in the racial wealth gap and other challenges that we're facing fundamentally, the differences in terms of capacity, in terms of home ownership and not, the rising prices. So, you know, the question is this issue of who does that economy work for? You know, how do we measure that? And it's very clear that people are having very different experiences engaging with the economy. So I think it is something that we have to hold on as true and recognizing that we see, again, just this sheer level of inequality that's out there. It's very clear that people are really struggling right now. The amount of support that we see needed, whether it's about SNAP benefits or WIC and others. I mean, it's out of control right now. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is what I was saying in my opening remarks about this deep unpredictability. When I talk to people about the economy, especially those that are struggling right now, I ask them this question. I say, hey, look, I just I drove out past the gas station around the corner from my home. Gas right now, at least in my part of Jersey, is under $3. And I say, does that make people feel better? And people say, no, because we don't know what's going to happen next week or next month. So it's not just about the price right now. It's wrapped into what I was saying in my opening remarks, that we live in a time of such unpredictability. And that causes such unease for people. It's just like this anxiety that we face because we don't know what's coming next. I can't tell you, where our economy is going to be or what's going to happen politically in our country 6 months, a year from now, let alone 1 week from now. I mean, look at the summer that we had politically. We had a candidate drop out of the presidential race, attempted assassinations. I mean, there's so much that we worry about on so many fronts. And I was telling you about, we've been living on the cusp of a government shutdown every single month for the last 2 years, possibly defaulting on our debt. There's just a lot of anxiety. So that's something that we have to grapple. It's not, when someone says they're worried about high costs, it's not just about the cost right now. It's about the anxiety that they feel about what could come next, the unpredictability there. So those are some of the things that I've learned from my time on the trail.
A related issue, and you referenced it a little bit in your opening remarks, it doesn't seem to get a lot of attention these days, is the federal deficit and the national debt. Something that at least reliably and predictably keep getting bigger. Yeah. So the question that came in, I thought it was really interesting. Do these growing numbers, federal deficit, national debt, do they have any tangible effect on everyday people? Because they seem to be just a number that you read in the paper. Does it really affect people's lives? And if so, what can be done about it?
Well, yeah, look, it does. It does have an effect on it because a number of fronts. One is that, we just keep kicking the can down the road. And so this question about responsibility, the question about the role that government can play, I often think about it as what can government do that no one else can do? How do we focus government on trying to play that unique capability? But, when we have this environment right now of just, both parties, honestly, pushing on the gas when it comes to spending, thinking about that, but not thinking, and not having the same kind of unity in terms of thinking about, where to be able to raise the revenue from. We're having these debates about, what's going to happen next with the Trump tax cuts, right? What we saw with the South tax cap, other issues that are out there that, really cause a lot of challenges when it comes to addressing our deficit. Big disagreements in that. So, I do think that it plays a big role because, this is part of why it is that, I'm having these battles down in Congress with some of my colleagues that are right now calling for major cuts to SNAP benefits, WIC benefits, Head Start programs, other aspects of this. It's a fundamental question of what is the role of the government that gets down to it. So yes, it does affect everyone's day-to-day lives. It may not be so visceral in an immediate sense, but it just hangs over our politics in many different ways and really shapes the way and the tone as well as the atmosphere of conversations and debates down in Congress.
You've served in the House since January 2019, and the House of Representatives is obviously a very seniority-based institution. It's hard to have much clout in those early years for any congressional career. Nonetheless, what is your proudest achievement so far in your time in Congress?
Yeah. So let me frame it in two ways in terms of impact. So you're right. I'm still relatively new there. I was sworn in at the age of 36, now 3 terms in. But as I said in the remarks, I won a district Trump won twice. In the year 2020, Trump won my district, but I did as well. And I was one of only 7 Democrats in the entire country to win a district that Trump won that year. That's it, only 7 of us. So out of about 225 Democrats in the House of Representatives that year, only 7 of us won districts that Trump won. That means if me and 4 others, that means that we had only a 5-vote majority, in the House of Representatives. That means if me and 4 others of these Democrats in these Trump districts, if we all failed to outperform partisanship and our districts went the way of the presidential race, it means we would not have had the majority. And that means that we would not have had the American Rescue Plan or the CHIPS and Science Act or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or the Inflation Reduction Act or the PACT Act to support veterans' health care. And so I say that by saying I'm proud that I was able to deliver a majority. Yes, I might not be the most senior Democrat in the House of Representatives, but none of the most senior members of the Democratic Party in Congress would have been able to do anything unless we had the gavel. And there were 5 of us that for 2 years, I was 20% of the House majority. That's how narrow things were. So I saw how a quiet suburban South Jersey congressional district helped change the course of American health history, help enable the kind of gains that were able to move our country forward in extraordinary ways. The other thing that I'll say is I've now done 80 town halls as a member of Congress. I go all over, try to engage, and I try to be and reflect my legislative agenda and priorities based off of what I hear. My job is not to impose my views on the constituents, but instead to draw from them. And I kept hearing a lot from seniors in particular about the high cost of prescription drugs. Some senior, I remember one person in Barnegat was telling me that he pays about $500 to $600 every single month for his prescription drugs. Like $5,000, $6,000 out of pocket every single year. So I took that, worked with some of my colleagues. I co-authored legislation that would cap out-of-pocket costs for seniors when it comes to their prescription drugs at $166 a month. I was able to work with Frank Pallone and others to negotiate this into the Inflation Reduction Act, and we passed it into law. And starting this coming January, no senior in America on Medicare will ever have to pay more than $166 a month for their prescription drugs, no matter what problems they have, whatever issues they have, cancer or whatnot. I know that's still a lot for a lot of seniors, but it creates that sense of just relief that things aren't going to get catastrophic for them. That's going to save a lot of money for people across this country. And I was proud that I was able to author that legislation and get that into law.
Thank you, Congressman. As you might imagine, there were any number of questions that came in regarding the Middle East. And so I've tried to whittle it down to this. Since the attacks of last October 7th, the situation in the Middle East, specifically involving Israel and Iran, Iranian-backed groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen, the whole situation seems to be spiraling out of control. Your experience in foreign affairs is a welcome addition to this conversation. So what's your assessment of the situation? What should the United States be doing?
Yeah. No, this is something that I think about a lot. You're right. I've worked in the Middle East throughout my career. For a number of years, my job was actually to try to counter Iranian exportation of violence throughout the Middle East. So in particular, my job was to try to stop the Quds Force, then General Qasem Soleimani, Hezbollah, Kateb Hezbollah in Iraq, Asab al-Haq in Iraq and Syria. And so I know these groups very well. And yeah, look, this is an unbelievable challenge right now. And the thing that always kept me up at night the most when I was working in the Middle East was this worry about the regional war. I remember in the Middle East, people would refer to it as the coming war. They just assumed that it was going to happen at some point. No one knew exactly when, but people were gearing up for it. And it was very scary. And this is about as close to it as I've ever seen. We're a year out from October 7th. We still have 101 hostages held. A lot that we've seen in terms of just the sheer destruction in Gaza that's going to take decades to be able to rebuild. And this question about, not just short-term games, but what is an actual durable to peace? And I say that knowing full well that, talking about a two-state solution is something that feels so distant and far right now, feels so intangible in many ways. But that doesn't mean we give up on the idea. And in the broader Middle East, yeah, look, I mean, I do think that we need to be very careful at this point. You know, when you see what happened in what's going on in Lebanon, I mean, yes, as I told you, I know full well the dangers of Hezbollah and the actions that they have taken, not only destabilizing the region, but destabilizing Lebanon. You know, they have not had a president there in 2 years now. You know, I do think that there's a moment right now to try to marshal, you know, coalition building to put pressure on the acting prime minister in Lebanon is open to trying to call for new elections for a president. I think this is a moment to try to put into place leadership there that isn't beholden to Hezbollah. But that's not going to solve all the problems. You know, I do think that what comes next, you know, as someone who worked on the counter-ISIS fight, you know, the effort that I always tried to lead was this effort of what comes the day after. You know, what is going to be the day after, you know, eventually the violence end in Gaza? What is it the day after the hostages come home hopefully alive? What is it going to be the day after? And right now, all the leaders that I'm talking to throughout the entire Middle East, nobody's thinking about this. No one's engaged in this with the level of intensity that it deserves. And I worry that that many of them are losing focus and getting caught up in this escalation of violence. So I don't think that as the longer that this violence goes on, I don't think it serves anybody well. I think it's only going to make everyone less secure. So I'm very worried about this moment, and I've been engaged with a lot of the leaders around the region, making my own calls, as well as engaging with the Biden administration, Tony Blinken and others to try to marshal this. And I told the president, you know, you're not running for re-election. Like, use this moment to try to do things that others can't. You know, step out and try to be bold at this moment. I don't know exactly. I can't tell him the perfect things to do, but I hope that he understands, you know, what it is, not just for his legacy, but to really try to break this cycle of violence that we have seen in the Middle East, unfortunately, for lifetimes.
One of the ways people around the country learned about you was through a now iconic photograph of you laid on January 6, 2021, helping Capitol Hill custodial staff pick up garbage in the rotunda in the aftermath of that day of violence. The question is about civility. Why has civility seemed to disappear from public discourse in America, and how can we restore it?
The challenge that we face right now, it can't necessarily be summed up in a pithy way, but the best way that I'll say it is that we're losing touch with this idea that we're part of something bigger than all of us. You know, etched in the ceiling above the Oval Office and painted in the rotunda dome in the Capitol is that motto of our country, E pluribus unum, right? And this idea of out of many, one. And I've been meditating on that idea a lot lately because we could use a lot more of that. Right now, it feels like the actual motto is out of many, many. You know, it doesn't feel like we're actually able to unify. So I've meditated on this idea, out of many, one. But the challenge is, honestly, that there's a word missing. There's no verb. There's nothing telling us how do you get from many to one. It's a great idea to aspire towards, but I wish they gave us some roadmap. So I've been digging through this, trying to understand what's the origin of this phrase. How is it that we can engage? And since I'm in a school setting, I think you will appreciate me nerding out a little bit. But I tracked it down to a saying from Cicero. And this idea of out of many, one, Cicero says that the missing verb is to love. And I thought that was a really beautiful idea, this sense to love. But you can imagine how difficult it is to do that on a societal level. 330 million people spread out across an entire continent. It's a challenge. To me, I believe that the act of service is an act of love. I think that how we solve this problem is, I think we need a new era of public service in America. I think we need a new ask not what this country can do for you kind of moment. That we have to try to invest in this, and we're seeing it. And it's a challenge. I mean, like I have I won't name names right now, but like I have a colleague that I talked to in Congress on the other side of the aisle who literally told me that like part of the plan is to make politics so toxic that like regular human beings don't want anything to do with it. And like, unfortunately, it's working. You know, like how many people do we know? You know, you turn on the news, it gives you a headache. You try to just distance yourself from it. So many young people, I'm glad so many of you are here in this room, and I really do earnestly ask you to consider a life of service in government work. My first boss at the State Department, he had a line. He said, you don't have good government unless you have good people working in government. Government is not some abstract morass, abstract blob, abstract machine of gears and cogs. It is fundamentally a reflection of the quality of the people that work within it. If you have egotistical, narcissistic, power-hungry people in government, you will have an egotistical, narcissistic, power-hungry government. But if you have people serving that believe in that sense of public service, that believe that empathy is a strength, not a weakness, that believe that humility is more important than hubris, people that all together are recognizing this at a fundamental way, you can have something altogether different. So I really do hope that we can pull out of this spiral right now, because it's very scary. As I said, we're on an unsustainable trajectory as a country. And that sense of civility, that sense of service, it's not going to just happen on its own. It's going to take a real societal commitment to do it. I don't know exactly what it's going to be that's going to trigger us in that moment. But I worry. I came into public service because I was a sophomore in college when September 11th happened. And I felt a call to serve. And I've now served this country for over 2 decades. But I worry that if there was an attack or some major crisis in this country, that we wouldn't unify as a country given how divided we are. I think the pandemic, January 6th, and other things like that give us a sense of how we would react. More finger pointing, more blaming, more scapegoating. So I hope that we can change this, and I'm going to do everything I humanly can over my lifetime to do it. I've dedicated my whole life to one singular question of how do we heal this country? Not if we can heal it, but how do we heal it?
I want to take advantage of you being here because of your unique experience. What was January 6th like for you?
It was start of the day. I didn't think, I didn't know what was going to happen. I told my staff not to come into work that day because I was worried something could happen, but I thought it was more about something outside of the Capitol, people trying to drive in and take the subway in. I remember once we got the alert on our phones, we got an alert telling us to shelter in place, and that was a really surreal experience. I've worked in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I've sheltered in place a lot over the course of my career. I just never imagined I would do it at the United States Capitol. And there was an alert that came out saying, do not go to the Capitol, and it said, because we have lost control of it. And that was just such a surreal email to receive, knowing that for a period of time, the United States government did not have control over the United States Capitol. I try to think about it in just this sense. I told you, I believe that empathy is a strength, not a weakness. Empathy needs to flow in all directions, not just in the directions of the people that you agree with. So I tried to get into the minds of those that showed up and did such damage that day. Just the level of distrust they must have in government, the level of vitriol, the level of hate, not just hatred, but straight up contempt that we have. I believe that the Capitol building is the physical manifestation of Article 1 of the Constitution. So to defile and disgrace that building is to defile and disgrace our Constitution. And for self-proclaimed patriots to come and break down the windows, break down the doors, how far gone they are in terms of believing that their country has been taken from them. And it shows you the level of challenge that we face in such a deep and profound way. I will never be able to unsee, the fact that we saw Americans fighting other Americans inside the United States Capitol, something we never even saw during the Civil War. And as someone who worked in a lot of failing and failed states around the world, seeing actions that you would just never imagine here in America. That I would call my wife and deliver the same phone call or a similar phone call that I've had to deliver to her once before in Afghanistan when when our base came under attack, telling her, I'm okay right now, but I don't know what's going to happen next. That's sad. That's really sad. I didn't necessarily myself feel directly in danger on that day, but the fact that we just didn't know what was going to happen. I remember having to put my ear up against the wooden door of my office when I would hear footsteps go by because I just didn't know whose footsteps those are. Wondering, is that someone that can help me figure out what's going on, or is that someone that might try to do something different? So I just sort of say that as just this sense of sadness that we experienced that. And that unfortunately 4 years later, I don't know what's going to happen on January 6, 2025. I doubt it'll be the same problem directly. We took actions like the Electoral College Count Act that, make sure we indicate that this is ceremonial that day, something that should have been known. I'm sure there'll be lots of fencing and guards and things like that to prevent. But the next great challenge to our democracy, it could come from a legal challenge or something else. But unfortunately, the question isn't better. In fact, I would argue that it's profoundly worse than it was 4 years ago in terms of the level of distrust in our system. And that breaks my heart. And it's going to show just how long of a road ahead it is to heal. It isn't just about one person and whether or not they're in the Oval Office or not. This is a deep wound, and this is going to be something that takes decades to be able to fix.
We've hit the end of our time, and I want to ask the final question that we ask everybody who stands on this stage. RIPAC tradition is this concluding question. Congressman Kim, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you were their age?
When I was in college, I was really excited to step up and serve, but I didn't think it was I didn't think I had a place. 20 years ago, I graduated college, and I took a train from Chicago down to DC. I was a romantic at heart. I thought it'd be nice to take a train. It was the wrong idea. It's a really big country. So I got into Union Station. Many of you have been there. You step out of the doors, you see the beautiful Capitol. I think it's one of the most beautiful views of any train station in the world. And I remember being both simultaneously thrilled and excited, but also terrified. I was kind of terrified because I realized at that moment that I didn't know anybody in the entire city of DC. I didn't know anybody, not a single person that I could call if I needed help. And I think I just came overwhelmed with this feeling that this place isn't for me. I'm the son of immigrants. I'm a public school kid from South Jersey. My parents never taught politics at the dining room table. I knew nobody that ever worked in government. I'm from a family of nobodies. In DC, it felt like it was a city full of somebodies. People who have well-known last names, legacies, people whose grandparents and great-grandparents were in the Great Wars and fought for this country. Who am I? And I just felt really isolated. And it wasn't helped by the fact that, when I joined up at the State Department, I served this country. I told you I worked in Afghanistan and Iraq. When I came back from Afghanistan, I remember I one day showed up at work, and there's a white envelope on my keyboard back in D.C., and I opened the envelope, and the envelope now said this letter. The letter said that I've now been banned from working on issues related to the Korean Peninsula because I'm Korean American. You want to know how that made me feel? I felt humiliated. I felt disrespected that I risked my life for this country, and now they're saying that they don't trust me, that they don't think that I'll be loyal to this country if I work on issues related to my ancestral homeland. It made me feel like they didn't think I was 100% American, that I'm American until my Korean heritage. That I stepped up to run for Congress. People telling me, you seem like a nice kid and all, but there's no way you're going to win. My district, 85% white, less than 3% Asian, voted for Trump. They said there's no way you can pull this off. I can't stand being underestimated constantly. People thinking that I can only appeal to and connect with people that look like me. you are as American as anybody else. You have every bit as much right to represent this state, this country, as anybody else. That our vote on November 5th, you have as many votes on that day as a billionaire does. This is the great equalizer. So there are going to be a lot of times in your career, I'm sure, where you'll feel like, I don't know if this is what I can do. I don't know if this is right. What I always say is don't self-select yourself out of things. If it's something you care about, go for it. I had so many people call me and tell me a year ago, call me up, tell me to drop out of this race. Say it was not my time to run for Senate. Telling me that I'm the wrong kind of minority run statewide. Telling me that there's just no chance that I can take on the most powerful political family in the state and be able to get through. And I just told them, look, I can't look my two boys in the eye if I drop out of this race knowing full well I have every bit as much right to be able to participate in my democracy as anybody else. Know your power. Don't let people push you around. If it's something you care about, fight for it. Thanks.
On that note, I want to thank Congressman Kim. That was really appreciated, sir. For you, and I hope we don't violate some ethics rule, so you can hand it back if you can. But I just want a genuine RIPAC t-shirt, purple this year. This is, a collector's item eventually. On the back, just what you were talking about, what we need. Workforce development for democracy, which is exactly what we do. Congressman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For you. Here you go.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
That was great.